something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. This is the excerpted first portion of the full episode of Devil's Chess Club. If you want to see more of the interview in today's episode, please consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. We have hundreds of episodes available for subscribers. If you want to better understand subjects like the JFK assassination and the role of organized crime in our political regime, American Exception is the best place to go for the deep history of the U.S. empire. The URL is patreon.com/AmericanException. Subscribe if you can, and either way, please kindly like this video and subscribe to this American Exception channel. Ken McCarthy, it's great to be with you.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Now, you are the author of these two books. You've put them out, John F. Kennedy, Anti-Imperialist, and JFK and RFK's Secret Battle Against Zionist Extremism. So these are two books that have good sources of different documents and speeches that are related to what the Kennedys did. So a lot of this is really the Kennedys in their own words. But why was this subject something that you thought worthy of putting these two books out, to sort of clarify the record?
Sure. Well, we are currently underwriting and financing a genocide in Gaza and now the West Bank, and I want as many Americans as possible to have as broad an understanding as possible of the fact that, hey, maybe Israel isn't our friend. And nothing, I think, says that with greater resonance than the fact that it without a question, it's not really questioned at this point, if people look into it, that people talk about the CIA and people talk about the mob, and everybody sort of accepts that. But what they don't understand is the very top echelon of the mob and the CIA were Zionists. And they had all kinds of interactions with Israel. And the Kennedys were actually pushing back very hard on Israel in the summer of 1963. And Israel saw that as an existential crisis. Now, I'm not saying Israel arranged for the Kennedys to be killed, but they had friends that were involved in it, and they profited massively because they got LBJ, who comes from a Christian Zionist family, who had, close relations with all kinds of crazed Zionists throughout his life. And he just opened the coffers and gave them everything they wanted, including allowing them to murder U.S. servicemen in broad daylight and get away with it. So the Kennedy. So I think if the average American, instead of talking about, did Jack Ruby really know Lee Harvey Oswald? I mean, all that stuff's interesting, but we need to know that there's a country out there that we are way too enmeshed in that is not our friend. And this is just one example of how they're not our friend.
So as far as the top echelons of the CIA being Zionists, this is something that I am agnostic about because I don't quite understand Alan Dulles' position on the matter. The Dulles brothers seemed to be more on the Eisenhower, CFR, Sullivan and Cromwell sort of waspy side of things that would have been in part responsible for the way Eisenhower responded to the Suez Crisis versus LBJ's response, So why do you say that the top echelon of the CIA was? I don't know how exactly to characterize Angleton's purview as the top echelon, or is it the subterranean something? I mean, this is a difficult thing to try to perfectly express.
Yeah, no, this is exactly the right thing to focus on. And here's my view. Dulles lasted as head of counterintelligence through 5 different CIA heads.
Angleton.
Excuse me, pardon me, Angleton. Thank you. And and he was close with Dulles, and Dulles, gave him that position. So when somebody survives 5 different terms, that's like Fauci, or that's like J. Edgar Hoover. There's something going on. He also, throughout that period, was head of the CIA's Israel desk and the liaison to the Mossad. So, and that's very weird, because you don't usually have 2 jobs like that. You're either, chief of station or head of a desk, or you're the head of this, or you're not like multiple jobs. He was revered. Yeah,
that's a very shady arrangement that they had there.
Yeah. And he was revered by the Zionists and the Israeli government. There are not 1 but 2 memorials to him in Israel. Now, important question: did he like Jewish people? I imagine he was an anti-Semite, a mild anti-Semite, not a raving one, but like all of and he was WASP to the bone. His name is Jesus because his mother was Mexican. And his father was a super duper go-getter corporate dude who was very successful at National Cash Register and WASP to the bone. And he was so good that he raised funds to become the licensee for National Cash Register in Italy during the 30s. Now that may seem like, well, that can't. Red cash registers, what's the big deal? You have to understand, there were no computers. The cash register was cutting edge technology in the early 20th century. People before that kept their cash in a drawer. You'd go to a store and the guy would open the drawer and like count it out. So cash registers were a big deal. And his father was a super go-getter. And now he was in Italy. What did that mean? Well, Italy was a fascist state, and you could not, you would not know that if you chose Italy as your base, and you could not be friendly. You could not fail to be friendly with all the fascist business people and government people if you wanted to establish a beachhead for National Cash Register in Italy. So his father was, like many Americans of that era, businessmen, including the Rockefellers, was very fascist friendly. And so Angleton, total WASP, probably a mild anti-Semite, but he didn't care, because I think he correctly perceived that the Zionists and Judaism were 2 completely different things, as do the Zionists, right? The foundational Zionists created Zionism in a reaction against Judaism business as usual. They didn't like the idea of pacifism. They didn't like the idea of Jews living within all these different countries and adapting to the country they were in and being of good citizens. They didn't like that. They wanted Israel. They wanted Jewish people to be muscular, ass-kicking guys with their own country. And
it's a very weird thing. And as we see how it's developed, when you look at the writings of these guys, I haven't read that much of them, but every time the things that I do, the snippets of them, they seem more like the fascists than anything else. Like, I mean, that's so obvious.
Well, Jabotinsky, right? So he was a linguist. He was fluent in Italian, and he was based in Italy for quite a while. And the I was going to call them the fascists. The Zionists really loved Mussolini, and they didn't like the British that much. They were hoping to replace the British mandate with an Italian mandate, and so they were going to Italy, and they were meeting with people and so on. And the reason they liked Italy so much is they liked the way the Italians massacred Ethiopian civilians during their incursion there. In fact, that was one of the first aerial bombardment of civilians in history. And the Zionists thought that was great. And Mussolini, in turn, liked the Zionists a lot. In fact, they established naval training, like advanced naval military training in Italy for Zionists with the approval of Mussolini. So you could be a Zionist and not care one way or the other about Jews. And so Angleton, I believe, falls into that box. He was probably just like the Dulles brothers. He probably had some, I don't know what the word would be, but disregard for Jewish people, as a lot of waspy guys did. But that didn't prevent Angleton from embracing the Zionists, because the Zionists were fascists. In fact, in the 30s, it was acceptable and common to call yourself a fascist Zionist. Right? It's no longer a very attractive thing to say, but that's how
it's redundant at this point.
Right? It's redundant, but they literally were. They embraced fascism, by the way, as did so many Americans, including the Rockefellers. They thought fascism was great. The Time magazine, Mussolini Man of the Year. Why? Because capitalism, this thing we call capitalism, and I think it's too mild a name for what it is. It really should be called gangsterism, like corporate gangsterism.
But it's corporate. Yeah, this is what blows my mind, is because I taught U.S. history for a long time, and this was what civilization is a brutal enterprise to begin with. But capitalism and feudalism is not. I agree with Marx basically that capitalism was revolutionary in getting rid of feudalism, and in that way, it has to be recognized as sort of a step in the stage of human progress. But it was, and always, at its core, it's just theft and racketeering and rent extraction, exploitation, expropriation. It's just gangsterish, and it's so we're raised to not understand that most obvious thing, and it's really astounding the more you get it.
They work very hard to pull the wool over our eyes. I mean, there is a thing called free enterprise, and that's the guy that buys a truck and gets some tools and goes out and fixes roofs, puts a crew together, charges a fair rate, pays everybody. That's a good thing, right? But capitalism is literally rule by the guys that have the most money, who tend to be gangsters in reality, right?
The only way that you get to the person with the most money is if you most single-mindedly and unscrupulously pursue that above all else, which just encourages the worst. It aggrandizes the worst personalities. Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, sometimes they do good things. I think Steve Jobs is an example. But he was not a warm and fuzzy guy, and they a lot of labor abuses from the very beginning of the company and all the way obviously to today, and they somehow sweep all that under the rug. But that's criminal behavior,
right?
Taking advantage of workers, working them so hard, they're committing suicide at such a rate. You have to put nets in the atrium because they're jumping off the second and third and fourth floors. I don't know if people are aware of that, but that was actually going on in some of those Chinese factories where the iPhone was being made. Which, by the way, interestingly enough, they also had to do on some slave boats. They had to net all around the boat, because some people realized, wow, they're taking us to God knows where, and I don't want to die a slave, and people would jump off. And talking about the history, the first time I went to England, I was blown away because the wealth there. Now maybe they've blown most of it, and the economy's falling apart, and their industrial base is gone, but the core of the wealthy people there are wealthy still. I remember going through a magazine, and they were like, "Oh, you can buy these socks. They're made from the underbelly of a Mongolian yak, but they're so delicate you can only wear them once, and they're 250 pounds a pair." This was in the 80s, right? And I'm like, okay, what's going on over here? So I just looked into English history, and English history starts out with the king having a monopoly on all wool exports, right? Nobody else, you could grow wool, but you couldn't export it. And if you violated that law and they caught you, they'd cut your hand off and nail it to a tree. All right, gangster, Imagine the worst gangsters in the most, depraved ghetto in the most, war-torn Central American country, and you just don't get any worse than that, right? And then you go, well, okay, what else did the English do? Well, they really got their start as pirates. You know, the Queen would say, hey, there's all these Spanish ships going around. Here's some documentation that says you can legally rob them. That was the beginning of British wealth. And then they saw that the Spanish wanted slaves, so they thought, well, we'll get into that business and provide slaves. And they realized where
they had a monopoly. They had a monopoly on the slave trade for a long time.
Yeah, economically.
The Crown Royal African Company had the monopoly. It was the
Crown literally, had a cut of that, right? And
no, they had as I understand it, they had a monopoly, like the Crown Royal African Company was for a few centuries they owned this monopoly, and it's only when they get that monopoly taken away to sell slaves in the Western Hemisphere, basically the Spanish. I don't know about the Portuguese issue either, but like that was the deal. And then when the English finally lose that monopoly, that's when they find God and decide that they have to stop the slave trade.
Well, then the other thing too is they had all these Indians that they could work to death as well, but pay them a little bit. And that was sort of the second wave in the Caribbean. Yeah. I'm more familiar with how it worked on the Spanish side. So the way American Spain worked was the guy that stole the money. So the guy that stole the money, through whatever he was doing in the Americas, would get a third. A third went to the governor of the province, and a third went to the crown. And this is exactly how mob crews work, right? You got the Godfather. And then he's got these officers, and then they go and they have their crews literally, and then the crews go and steal and pillage and do whatever it is, blackmail and gambling, drugs, whatever. They've got to stay in the game. They have to kick part of it up to the crew leader, and then the crew leader has to kick part of it up to the Godfather. So Spain was just operating like a mafia organization. And so then the British said, hey, these Spanish seem to be doing really well with the slave business. What are they doing? And then they said, oh, we can grow stuff. So they started growing, sugar cane and all that. And then they took that money and they financed the Industrial Revolution, which was, of course, taking cotton from the American South and in the satanic mills. And I'm sure you've looked into that phrase, satanic mills, is not exaggerated at all. Like they would take small children. Why do they use small children? Because they could get their hands into the equipment better. So like 8, 9, 11 years old. And a job in those mills was to walk around the machines with a whip in hand. And if a kid wasn't working hard enough, just to beat them with a whip. And a lot of those kids didn't make it to, adulthood. And those were the victims of the enclosures, of course, right? It's like, people had a pretty good life. You could, graze your sheep, and then your wife could, make things, looms. I guess the men worked at that too, but mostly the women. And by the end of the year, you were fed, you had some extra money. And then when the enclosures were taken off, all those families were impoverished. So that created this vast labor field. Yeah. And these guys would come around, and these families were starving. And they say, hey, we'll take your kid, we'll train him in a trade, everything will be beautiful. Well, they took them to these satanic mills. And then at one point, England had 80% of the entire market for finished cotton in the world. And they used that as a cudgel to destroy the textile industry in India and everywhere else. And you probably know this, and it took me the longest time to figure this out. You always see Gandhi, posing by a spinning wheel. I'm like, oh, that's kind of aesthetically interesting. And then I heard this quote of his. He said, if you want to be free, spin the wheel, turn the wheel. And so I never understood what any of that was. So I'm in Manchester, England, which was where all that took place. And I see a statue of Abraham Lincoln with like a speech of his. I'm like, what the hell? And so when the Civil War came along, there was what they called a cotton famine in Manchester. And these guys who were already suffering terribly were suffering even more. But they wrote a letter. This is the most beautiful story in labor history, and everybody should know it. They wrote a letter to Lincoln and said, listen, we're starving. Keep fighting. We don't believe in slavery. right? And that was a correspondence between the workers of Manchester and Lincoln. So it just started to open my eyes as to what what was really going on. And so then another thing we were talking about earlier. I grew up in New York City in the 1970s, and you just can't imagine what a social train wreck it was. And it was also corrupt as hell. And I saw all kinds of crazy things. Like when I used to live with my grandmother in the Bronx, and there was a store called the Bicycle Shop. And it was like right on a main drag. And you look in the window, and there was one bicycle sitting in the in the room. And there was like a desk with or a counter with a cash register. But then there was a door in the back. And that was where the real stuff went on. I don't know what was going on in there, but it was obviously a criminal enterprise. And it was operating in broad daylight, right? And I went to a very, pretty conservative Catholic high school in New York City. And this is a true story. One of my classmates' dad was a cop. And whenever they did a drug bust, he would scoop out a big thing of cocaine and take it home. And to us, to solve or assuage or whatever the word is, his guilt, to the degree he had any, he would share some of it with the priests at the school. Right. So you have to understand, this is like a hyper conservative world. And I'm told, this, and we got to walk in line. Everything's got to be perfect. And meanwhile, these people were degenerates, and the cops were degenerate. Yeah. Was that?
Yeah. This aspect of it is of the underworld as being kind of everywhere, above, below, throughout the society. And being so fundamentally of the same essence as the system itself. This is, what I mean? The things that the same way we deny the power of the criminal element in the criminal element, even as we commonly understand it, as people who are like breaking laws all the time and racketeering, etc. Like this is just we also deny it in the system itself, which is this system of exploitative wealth and domination of society by a small group of people. So there's all this denial that goes around. And when I have what I'm trying to figure out, or when you're talking about the Kennedy assassination, you've written this book on this, and the backdrop is like this gangsterism that's in the system itself. And when you watch something like the movie The Irishman, for example, and the way it depicts Jimmy Hoffa, and you go back and you look at what the Teamsters were doing and what was happening in the 60s and 70s, and RFK's book on organized crime, and really how broad and sweeping his investigations were and what he was trying to do, and then how they were thwarted, it shows you how mobbed up this whole system is. And this is what I've tried to, or it's complicated how I've tried to understand the JFK assassination, and then understanding that there is this Israeli role in it, which I think if there was any doubt about it before, the fact that Angleton, we know now that his Cuban business, quote unquote, involving the mob and all those plots against Castro that the CIA director didn't know about and the president certainly didn't know about, that Israel was basically managing all these, and that the CIA chose to conceal this from the public and is still trying to. They still have deleted that section from his church committee testimony, but they mistakenly released it earlier, thankfully. So we know what it was. But the issue is, how do we understand this role? Because I don't think that it can be as clear cut as Israel did it. And especially, I don't think this because it appears that Israel has blackmailed the U.S. over this issue in the past. When you look at the times that the issue almost got exposed or was threatening to be exposed, there are strange influences of these actors all around it, like people that are connected, like the Teamster connections of Bernard Finsterwald, for example. I mean, this is something that's really, I think, vexing to try to understand. So I guess what was the role of Angleton's Israel account and the fact that the mob was in essence dominated by Lansky, who was Mossad asset? What does this really mean for our understanding of this time period? Because this is a question that I grapple with a lot, and I don't think that I know the answer, but I've tried to work toward it. So what is the Israel influence in the JFK assassination? Is it a question of them being the ones behind it full stop? Or is it a question of the American imperial hive mind, especially the military brass and probably the old boys at the CIA, and the oligarchs of the US, the people that ran US Steel, etc., that there was just a consensus that Kennedy had to go, but because he controlled the state, they had to rely on these underworld elements, which are intertwined with Israel, who wanted him gone anyway. But in so doing this, perhaps they empowered these elements even more so, because that's what I think happened. But if you have a different take on it, because you're one of the few people that's actually tried to look at this issue seriously, and I have been working on this of late myself. So do you agree with my assessment there, or do you have a different one?
Yeah, I think Israel should be looked at as, there are our headbangers, like, and it goes back to the famous banking family, the
Rothschilds, the
Rothschilds.
Medicis,
So why did, and I sorry to go so far back in history, but I think it's really important. So why were the Rothschilds so interested in putting basically Europeans in the Middle East? They weren't interested in Jews, in the Middle East. I mean, that was the cover, but they wanted Europeans. They wanted their guys in the Middle East. And I think the answer is pretty obvious. Even before oil, the Middle East is critical for transport, just absolutely critical. I mean, England, for example, if they were going to get their stuff back and forth between India, the rape of India, which is one of the greatest economic crimes in the history of humanity, very rarely talked about. That was a prosperous country before the British arrived. And when they left it, it was a shambles. So anyway, you kind of have to deal with the Middle East because of geography. So I think the Rothschilds just said, well, we need our people in there. Who can we use? Oh, these Zionist crazy guys. They're energetic. I'll tell you from the business world, when somebody's going to back somebody in a startup, I was talking to this very successful guy that's funded about 200 different companies over his lifetime. And he says what he's looking for are strong founders. And what he's looking for in a founder, he uses the word savage. I'm looking for savages. Now, he doesn't necessarily mean criminals, but he means people that will do anything, like just stay up all night, do whatever it takes to make that business succeed. They're going to make it succeed. Well, you can turn that up a notch and you can have literal savages, like headbangers that we can count on. And if you look at it, it came to pass because when the Egyptians dared to, nationalize the Suez Canal, who was the cavalry that came first with the guns? It wasn't the British, it wasn't the French, it was the Israelis.
Right. They're joined at the hip with it goes back even further to like Oliver Cromwell era, wanting to colonize Palestine. So it has been a pipe dream of part of the British establishment, for ages.
Well,
I can't attempt to suss out the actual religious ideation of the Rothschilds themselves, how much they really feel. I mean, they have been major financiers of Zionism, but
Zionism.
What is their motivation for it? Is it just because it's a gangster enterprise? Because it's plausible that way. For the Brits, they needed to control that area. That's why the Suez thing was that was the end of their empire, and the U.S. let it in.
But who was in place? Who was put in place?
Yeah, right. I get it. They're joined at there's a relationship that goes way back there between the British a segment of the British elite that's super imperialist minded and the Zionists. It seems like that's who rules Britain today, because look at their policies. They're insane. Like Starmer is a warmongering lunatic, and he's part of the Labour Party. It's beyond farce.
Yeah, and then you can go back to the Crusades, even.
Right.
And what was the business? See, I'm actually a business person. That's my real thing. I do business, right? And so I always look at the deal. What's the deal? So the deal of the Crusades was, first of all, there was a schism between the Eastern and the Western Church, and then the Muslims were creating havoc and so on, and the Western Church wanted to kind of assert itself, and so the deal was, if you go, we'll give you, I think you're guaranteed to go to heaven. There's all these, like, all your sins are forgiven, and you can keep everything you steal. We just want you over there waving our flag, right? So this goes, and that's kind of what Israel is. We just steal whatever you want, kill whoever you want, but wave that flag. And what is the flag? The flag is fascist capitalism. And I want to talk about the for some reason I'm drawing the blank on the banking name again.
Rothschild.
Rothschilds. So what are the Rothschilds? The Rothschilds were people. They could have been Jewish, they could be Irish, they could be Muslim. It doesn't really matter what their background is. They were really, 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 really good bankers. And they amassed an insane amount of money. I don't think any family, group, country has ever amassed so much wealth in the history of humanity. And it was especially obvious in the 19th century.
Yeah, they somehow corner the British bond market.
They cornered so much stuff. They would, so you have these,
which gives them a real enormous amount of leverage over the state.
Yeah, but they were already doing things like, hey, these two principalities are fighting with each other. We'll lend them the money. We also have a side deal with the guys that are making the swords and the muskets, and so we get paid by those guys. Then we get the interest on the money, and then when the whole society falls apart, we go in and buy everything for 2 cents on the dollar. But I'll tell you a story about the family. So it's not really a family. It's a conglomerate, So I'm in Guatemala, right, and I'm talking with this human rights attorney, and we're talking about all kinds of different things. And I forget the name of this city we're in, but it's like a very European-looking city in the western part of Guatemala. And he starts telling me the history of the Rothschilds in Guatemala. Like, I didn't know they were in Guatemala. And he says, oh, yeah. I mean, you don't think these coffee trees just appeared spontaneously? Because think about coffee. Coffee grows in Yemen and in Ethiopia, right? Now we take it for granted. Somebody had to have agents all over the globe looking for economic opportunities. Because when you have a lot of money, the thing you have, it's kind of a burden. You have to be able to deploy it places. You have to spend it. You have to, like, you can't just sit on it, right?
No, this is a problem with the current economy. There are people with ridiculous amounts of money, and they don't have sort of comprehensible places to invest it in ways that aren't just so predatory.
Yeah. So that's, I mean, it's a hard problem for a normal person to relate to, but I know people like this. They're like, I got $20 million I got to put to work. And it's not unlike what how a loan shark thinks. He's got this money and he's got to find people to lend it to, So the Rothschilds had, and again, it's an enterprise. It's not a family. It's certainly not a religious organization, right? And so they had agents all over the world looking for deals. And so so one of their agents was in Guatemala, and this will explain a lot about Israel, believe it or not, because once you get this story, all of a sudden Israel makes perfect sense. So one of their agents said, hey, this would be a great place to grow coffee. And they knew they knew North America was coffee drinkers. They weren't tea drinkers. They knew North America was growing. They knew, hey, this is closer, just practical stuff, right? This is closer to North America than Ethiopia. And so that's good, right? Well, who had the money to acquire the land? Who had the money to buy the trees and ship them over? Find the horticulturalists that could teach the elites of Guatemala how to run a coffee plantation. That took and put in the trains, build the warehouses. So the way you and I might sit down and play checkers, like, I'm going to put this one here, you're going to put that one there, and we're going to like move across the checkerboard. They literally have the resources, financial and human and intellectual, to look at the planet that way. Like, oh, there's a country, it's got a lot of highland. Let's just import an entire enterprise. So I'm sure that's how they looked at Israel. It's like, we really need to be controlling that Middle East thing.
Yeah, there's a There's a similar story about, I think it's about California. It's about the west coast of the U.S., really what became the like Mexican cession. But it was this is in the Ronald Takaki's book, A Different Mayor, which is a really valuable, I think, history of the U.S. from a multicultural perspective, but not. It's a materialist perspective, like that deals with the different people in the U.S. But he discusses how it was someone who worked for a Rothschild banking interest that wrote this big report about how you would develop this as an economic juggernaut. It's like this super extremely valuable territory that would be a huge boon to the economy of the U.S. And then it's what happens. The way these guys develop things. I say these guys, I mean, just this is how capitalism works. Like it's
a banker's mentality, which is I've got this money, I've got to put it to work. And where's the opportunity? So I think the opportunity in the Middle East was, hey, we need our guys. We need guys that we can deal with in the Middle East. And so way back, that looked like Zionists, And of course, the Rothschilds spent a ton of money. Were they doing it out of kindness? I don't, out of generosity, out of wanting the Jews to have a homeland. Remember, there was no Holocaust back then.
Right, and as you say, these documents are amazing to read now in light of our current situation, and they're very straightforward in what they're arguing, and you can clearly see a different policy that Kennedy was pursuing compared to what came after it. It's really stark. So for people that say like, oh, the U.S. is a monolith, it never matters who the president is, it's always the same. You may think that, but the people that killed Kennedy didn't think that at all. And we see what has happened. So I will put the links to your books in the show notes. And Ken McCarthy, any way people can follow your work and your output besides looking at the books? I've
got this sort of website is called brasschecktv.com. brasschecktv.com, and people, I'm very irregular in when I post and if I post, but I've been doing it since 1997, and I have a lot of stuff about organized crime and government relations in San Francisco. If anybody's a San Franciscan and wants, I'm pretty good at that. I forgot even to mention that, but I knew where all the bodies were buried, literally, in that one city. And so brasschecktv.com, and JFK and RFK secret battle against Zionist extremism. I'd love it if every American knew that the Kennedys were fighting back, pushing back against Israel extremism, and wanted peace in the Middle East. That's the other thing. We haven't mentioned Gaza, but this book was written for the people of Gaza to try to wake up the people of America to understand that Israel's not necessarily our friend. In fact, they're not.
Very good. Ken McCarthy, thank you very much.
Great. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. Please do consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. We need subscribers because we will never be viable on this platform. Isn't it strange that the majority of alternative media people who focus on the clandestine crimes of the imperial capitalist U.S. regime, isn't it strange that the majority of these people are political rightists? Shouldn't it be the left that says, yeah, these greedy criminals will do anything for money and power? Somehow many on the left think it is a mark of sophistication to deny state crimes like the assassinations of JFK, RFK, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. I have to believe that a lot of algorithmic juice and social engineering has gone into keeping the left studiously ignorant about the institutionalized criminality of our system of governance. We need to fight against this. So again, please do consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. Subscribe so that we can keep bringing light to the devil's chessboard.